Hey guys, I'm Iggy and welcome to episode 2 of Talisay House, The Process, where I'll be sharing my design process in designing the Talisay House from start to finish. Now, in the first episode, we covered context and concept, and if you haven't seen that episode, I highly recommend that you watch that first, because a lot of what we're going to be talking about in this episode will be based off of that. But just to refresh everyone about what we discussed, we studied the context behind the project and the design that we're trying to create, and then from there, we came up with our design objectives, which are to create a space for family gatherings by designing open common areas, to accommodate additional family members and visitors by designing multiple common areas around the house, to design a modern yet homey atmosphere by pairing familiar pieces and materials with the new, to create a fresh experience by integrating architecture with nature, to maintain privacy in a provincial setting with the use of proper zoning, and to design a house that echoes family history by preserving the silhouette of the original house. Then from those objectives, we arrived at our design concept, which is provincial luxury. Since we've covered context and concept, the question now is, how do we actually apply this to the actual design? How do we come up with specific design solutions to make sure that we hit our design objectives? I'll be covering that in the next 2 videos, and before I say anything else, I just want to set a disclaimer that there is no right way of doing this. This is actually, I would say, the messiest part in any design process, because this is where subjectivity and personal preference come in. It's important to keep in mind that the aesthetic part of design would always be subjective, and that you could have 2 very different solutions that achieve the same outcome. With that in mind, what I'm trying to achieve with the series is that, and actually what I'm trying to apply in my practice as an architect, is to explain my design process as objective as I could, to keep it systematic and organized so that even non-designers, non-architects, and people who aren't familiar with the subject could easily understand. Because at the end of the day, as designers, we must remember that we're designing for the people and not for ourselves. It's always for the benefit of the greater good rather than our own pride and selfish needs. With that being said, the way I'm going to approach the next 2 videos are in 2 parts. In this episode, I'm going to cover space planning, or how the spaces are organized inside the house. And then the next episode, I'm going to cover facade, or how the house looks like from the outside. And in architecture, when you're designing a structure, there are 2 basic drawings that you deal with. Those are the floor plans and the elevations. And for the benefit of those who don't know, the floor plan is a 2D representation of a house as seen from above, and an elevation is a 2D representation of a house as seen from outside, or when you're looking right in front of it. And my question while I was studying architecture was, which would come first, the floor plans or the elevations? And after years of practice, I would say it really depends on what you're trying to achieve. It really depends on what kind of structure you're designing, because if you're designing an iconic building like a museum, how it looks will play a great deal in how it performs. But if you're designing a hospital, which has a lot to do with planning and process and spatial relations, space planning will always be key. So at the end of the day, the design process is not actually linear. It wouldn't even matter which you do first, because there will always be instances where you go back, because doing one thing in a plan could reflect poorly in the facade, or doing one thing in the facade could reflect poorly in the plan. And that's why I say the design process is messy, because it's really not linear. So when I was designing this Talisay house, I was going back and forth. I would do something with the facade, I would do something with the plan, and then go back until I came out with a final outcome. But in the interest of explaining my process as objectively, as organized, and as systematic as I could, I'm gonna cover planning first and then the facade. So let's get it. So usually we start with an empty site, and we're going to analyze the conditions and base our decisions off of that. But since there's already an existing house, we're going to treat this like a major renovation and base our decisions off of what's already there. So in order for us to do that, we have to have an as-built analysis. And again, for the benefit of those who don't know, an as-built or as-built plan refers to what's already existing on site, what's already built there. So for example, you want to have your condo renovated. Designers would have to visit your condo, take measurements, and the drawing that they end up with is the as-built plan. But before we do that, it's still important for us to know how the original house relates to the site, because understanding how the architecture performs under these given site conditions will paint us a clear picture of how we can make the design respond even better. Because as I mentioned before, the architecture should always incorporate itself into nature and not the other way around. And how do we do that? We do a site analysis. So this is the existing floor plan on site. And first and foremost, we have to identify where our north is. Why is it important to do that? Because our whole site analysis will depend on where our north is. And it's represented by the circle, and where the radius meets the circumference is our north point. So you can dive deep into site analysis and analyze everything that's there, but I want to focus on two major aspects, and these are the wind path and the sun path. For the wind path, in the Philippines, there are two prevailing winds. We have the amihan, or the northeast monsoon. This is the cool wind. And we have the habagat, which is the southwest monsoon. And this is the warm and humid wind. And you can use this to strategically plan where your windows are so you can take advantage of the winds. So next is the sun path, and usually we plot it in 5 different locations. We start in the east at 6 a.m. where it rises, and then 9 a.m. This is our morning sun, 12 noon at its highest point, 3 p.m. afternoon sun, and finally sunset at 6 p.m. in the west. And again, we can use this to strategically design our house by identifying the hot areas, and as you can see, the hot areas are at the east and west sides, while the cool areas are in the north to south. This is where building orientation plays an important role, because we can avoid expensive design solutions to keep the house cool by just orienting the house in the right position. Now that we have an idea of how our house relates to the site conditions, we can now go over the spaces inside the house. So we enter through the ramp, which leads us to the porch. And right beside the porch is my grandfather's office, where he has his own library and conducts his meetings. And then we have the living room right as you enter the door. Beside the living room is the dining area, and right beside the dining area is the kitchen. Access through the kitchen is the maid's room, which has its own dedicated toilet, but it's outside. And beside it is the garage, where we would host guests, and it's actually also an extension of our dining area. Then we move to the master's bedroom, which is up front, which has its own toilet. And down the hallway are the boys' room and the girls' room, and they have a common toilet as well. So to analyze the space, we can look at it in 2 ways: zoning and flow. So for zoning, if we look at the floor plan, we have the common areas in yellow. This is the area where you can entertain guests and people outside of your family. Then we have the semi-private space, which is my lola's office, because it has somewhat of a restricted access. Then we have the private spaces where our bedrooms are, which ideally should only be accessed by my family. So for flow, this is where we think about the different scenarios that would act out inside this house. So we can break them into 2 aspects: users and activities. In this house, we have 2 users, and these are the family members and the guests. And for activities, I broke it down into the basic activities that would happen inside the house. So that's eating, sleeping, hygiene, and hosting guests, because we do that a lot. So when it's time to eat, the dining area is easily accessible from the bedrooms. If you're coming from outside, you can just enter through the front. And if you're the one cooking the meal, you could just enter through the doorway. If you're guests, you could also enter through the front. Or how it usually happens is that they enter through the garage and go back where the extension of our dining area is. For hygiene, the boys and the girls have a common toilet, and the master's bedroom has a dedicated toilet inside the room. The maid has its own toilet outside of the house. And this is where the problem starts, because if you're part of the family and you're anywhere else in the house, you're in the porch or the living room, the dining, or the kitchen, your only access to a toilet is back in the common area near the bedrooms, because nobody really uses the maid's toilet but the maids. And this is extra problematic when you have guests over, because this is their only access to a toilet also. You don't have a powder room for them. And as much as possible, we don't want them accessing the private zone. When it comes to sleeping, you could enter the bedrooms through the hallway. And if you're hosting guests, they could enter through the front to access the office or the living room, or they could also enter through the garage. But it starts being problematic when you have to leave, because if you're having guests over, you have no choice but to go through these people, because that's your only way out. Now that we've analyzed the floor plan, we can go into detail on the necessary adjustments to make the quality of the space better and hit our objectives at the same time. So starting with the ramp, what we can do here is to actually just widen it. and make it wide enough to fit 2 people at a time instead of just 1. And just by doing this, we already give the house a grander approach. And approach is important because in many ways, space planning is like storytelling, and having that impact even before entering the house already gives us an idea of the experience to come. And this leads us to the porch. And the porch is okay as is. It has a view of the garden, but it's only big enough to fit the monoblock furniture. And another thing is that it gets in between the living room and the view of the garden. So actually from the living room, you have no view. So what we can do is, we could extend the porch all the way in and relocate the living room completely. This gives us more freedom to design the space and give a proper preview of the look and feel that we're trying to achieve inside the house. Next, we take our steps and extend it all the way to the wall. And again, this just gives a more premium feel to the space. And what we end up with is this hallway that actually acts as our foyer. And for those of you who don't know, a foyer is somewhat like a lobby. And this is important because this is a transition space that gives us the option where to go. It delineates the common areas from the private areas, and if you're having guests over, this gives us the opportunity to travel from our bedrooms all the way to the front door discreetly without being seen. So then we end up with a space like this. So what we've done so far is to create this additional common area that's big enough and open enough to accommodate family and guests. We managed to create a clear boundary between the common areas and the private areas. And if you could imagine what it looks like, we haven't really done much to alter the facade. So it's really important to keep in mind our design objectives while we move the spaces around, because we don't want to work blindly. We want to be more intentional with our design decisions. So now our next concern is, where do we locate the living room? And since the original location of the living room deprived itself from having a view, we want the new location to be somewhere more open to the environment. This is in line with our objective of creating a fresher experience. So we can actually locate it at the back. But before we can do that, we have to open up the space to make this place accessible. So how do we do this? Well, since my family no longer has use for my lolo's office and it's been collecting dust all these years, what we could do is we could actually take the dining area and move it all the way to the front where the office used to be. Going even further, since the garage is an extension of the dining area, we want to relate these two spaces with each other even better. So we can achieve this with sliding glass panels. The transparency of the glass makes the dining area look bigger than it really is, and it also gives us a view of the garage and vice versa. And if we really want to make the space even bigger, we can slide the glass panels all the way in and give this illusion of having just one giant space. Another way to enhance this is to let natural light come in and give the dining area a view of the garden. So then we end up with a space like this. Now what's left is to clear the space where our current kitchen is. And how do we do that? Well, since my family these days have gotten used to the life without maids, we no longer have the use for the maid's room. So what we can do is we could take the kitchen and tuck it in where the maid's room used to be. Now we have a clear space, but to make it not look so empty, we can add an island counter in the middle, which could serve as an extension of the kitchen workspace or a breakfast nook for the family. And since we no longer have maids, we can now convert the maid's bathroom into a proper powder room. This gives us an easier access to a toilet from our common areas, and just to make it fit a little better, we can take our powder room and move it down a little bit just to align better to the rest of the house and end up with a space like this. Now that we've provided access, we can finally place our living room in its new location with glass walls all around that will give us a panoramic view of the garden. But then we end up with this pocket space in the middle. And if we want to maximize our footprint, we can have an additional common area by converting this into an outdoor deck. And similar to how the dining area connects to the garage, we can have this deck connect to the living room with the use of sliding glass doors. And when we slide the doors all the way back, we can now create this illusion of having an even bigger space that connects to the garden, so that we end up with a plan like this. And just to go even further and provide access to other parts of the house, we can add a footpath that goes all around. So now we've replanned the common areas inside the house, and what we've done so far is that we've created an open plan that connects the dining area, the kitchen, and the living room, and at the same time gives us a better sense of connection to the garden. And we've also added an additional common area in the outdoor deck that can double in size with the sliding glass doors. Now we move on to the private zone. So we start with the master's bedroom, and with the current furniture layout, we have the foot of the bed facing the bathroom door. And we also generally don't like having the headboard against the window because this wastes the opportunity of having that view. So as much as possible, we want to orient our bed towards the windows, towards the views. So we take the bed and we place it against the opposite wall, but then we end up blocking the door to the bathroom. So what we can do is we could flip the layout of the bathroom and have the door on the opposite side. Then we end up with this layout that actually has the bed centered to the room, and now we can place a closet, a desk, and a media cabinet on the opposite side. But we also want to maximize our views of the garden outside. So we can do this by extending our windows to the full length of the wall, and this just gives a more premium and luxurious feeling to the space. Yet we have to remember that this is a private space and we don't want people outside of the house easily looking in the bedroom. We don't want to be overly transparent. So what we can do is we could have folding panels outside of these glass walls, and these are called bifold panels with the way they fold open and close. And this just gives an extra layer of privacy and even protects the house during storms when they act as storm shutters. Next, we have the boys' room, and again with the current furniture layout, we have the foot of the bed facing the closet. But similar to the master's bedroom, we want it oriented towards the windows so that we maximize our views. But another issue that I have with this space is that I don't particularly like having all three doors at the end of the hallway. It just seems so crowded, so what I want to do is flip the door on the opposite side of the room, freeing up that space, and get the bed and place it against this wall. We can now have the closet and the desk on the opposite side and end up with a layout like this. Again, we want to maximize our view of the outdoors and let as much natural light come into the space, yet maintain that privacy that we need in a bedroom. So again, we can apply the similar technique of having full-length windows with bifold panels. For the girls' room, we have a furniture layout that's actually similar to a dormitory because when my mother was growing up in this house, they were actually 6 girls in the family and they all had to squeeze into this tight space. So now we have the beds actually oriented towards each other when we want the beds oriented towards the windows, again, to maximize our views. So for this layout, I'm going to assume that we only have one bed occupying this room. So we can rotate this bed and orient it towards the windows. We can take the closet and the desk and place it against the window so that we maximize the natural light coming in, and we end up with a layout that looks like this. And again, we can apply the same technique and have full-length windows with bifold panels. Now all that's left is a tiny adjustment in the common bathroom. First, I'm going to switch from a swing door to a pocket door, and what this does is it saves us space because instead of swinging into the bathroom, we can simply slide the door into the wall. This gives us more room for a larger lavatory, and I'm going to move the window to the end of the wall just to achieve a cleaner look. And with that, we have our final floor plan. So just to recap what we've done so far and measure it against our design objectives, we've created an open common area in the living, dining, and kitchen. We've added additional common areas in the porch and in the outdoor deck. We've created a fresher experience by opening up our spaces into the gardens, and we've maintained privacy by establishing clear boundaries and having the bifold doors. So I hope this video was insightful, and I know it was quite much to take in, but I still hope that you learned something. In the next episode, I'm going to show you how we're going to translate the floor plan that we made into the actual architectural design. So stay tuned for that. Again, if you have any questions, comment it down below. And if you like my content, please follow.